Good morning, everyone, and welcome to FPRI's panel discussion on Africa. This morning, we're going to be, first of all, we'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for your support of FPRI's programming and remind you that while these programs are free to you, they are not free to us. And so we encourage and solicit your support. If you're not a member of FPRI, I encourage you to join, but whatever support that you can give us is greatly appreciated. This morning, we have a distinguished panel of Africa experts who will be talking to us about the administration's policy on use of the African diaspora in implementing Africa policy. This is an issue that is millions of people, the traditional or legacy diaspora, and those people who are recent immigrants from the continent. What we're going to be looking at is the implications of the policy and where we think that policy is and where it's going. I'm not going to introduce each of the panelists by biography in detail because you have that in the invitation. But what I will do is ask each of them in order to talk to us for about 2 to 3 minutes, introduce the topic, then we'll discuss it. And at the midway point, we will go to you, the audience, for your questions. So please, as you're listening, put your questions in the Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat because we might miss them. Put them in the Q&A box, and at about 11, we will start answering your questions. And so to kick off, I'm just going to go by the icons on my screen. I'm going to ask Johnson to give about a 2-minute presentation.
I think you called on me, is that right? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. So good morning, everyone. My name is Krista Johnson. I'm Director and Professor at Howard University, and I direct our Center for African Studies here at Howard University. So this is a timely conversation, and I look forward to the discussion. I'll just make, I guess a few, maybe because I'm the first, I can just make a few remarks with regards to where things were left after the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2022. So most people on this call, I'm sure, are aware that President Biden put in place an advisory council on African diaspora engagement. That was one of the major outcomes, really, of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And for about a year now, that council has been convened, right? So we know the members of that council, and they've actually been really quite active over the past year. The executive director of the council is Denise Laurent-Manty, who is a Howard alum, I'll be proud to say, and has also has been very, very energized to travel the country, to participate in any number of activities, and to really kind of get out the word about the council and their work and those initiatives. So I would say, I think that there was a lot of kind of fanfare, even with regards to the council, and the council has held its second plenary session just, I guess, a month ago in Atlanta, where these are, kind of open public forums, which, have solicited, I think, a lot of input from community, which has been really great. I think also the establishment of the council has also encouraged similar commissions or councils at subnational level, state level, and even local level. I know in my own state of Maryland, the governor now has a new African Affairs Commission that's recently been established. So all of these are great things, but I think a lot of this really kind of builds on the enthusiasm and the kind of, I would really argue, political maturity of the African diaspora, where they're coming into their own, they're making their voices known, heard, and they're really advocating for different initiatives and activities. Less so, and so there's pros and cons to that. So it's less so kind of initiatives that are being driven by, say, State Department or other entities. An example of this there was recently, yesterday, I think, announced the Nigerian Diaspora Commission has now partnered with USAID Nigeria to work on a number of projects and to kind of expand USAID's footprint and then, I guess, influence there. I think the challenge that we have in terms of completely leaving this to these different diaspora entities is that it tends to silo Nigerian American commissions, Ghanaian Americans, kind of these various constituencies to advocate for and to push their agendas without having certain kind of common agendas. So one of the things that I would like to see, say, coming out of the President's Advisory Council, they talk a lot about, and even in the Atlanta meeting that they just had, they talked a lot about calling more for U.S. government policy support for AGOA, for example, or also more initiatives on climate change. And that's great in terms of advocating for that, but I think there needs to be a lot more mobilization in terms of really putting on I haven't seen yet policy briefs or kind of concept papers that the diaspora can engage around and also commit to and really push particular policy proposals forward on the part of the U.S. government. I know I've run out of time. In the Q&A, I'd love for people to ask about, because of course, I'm sitting here at a HBCU, so I'm very interested in focusing on and talking more about the role of HBCUs as incubators in promoting and supporting higher education on the continent. Also, just our changing demographics, where we just on Saturday had a Nigerian, the Nigerian Students Association had a cultural event which was very well attended and very well received, and it just kind of highlights, I think, the changing demographics, but also the kind of opportunities that exist on HBCU campuses to really engage the diaspora and the continent in collective ways. So I have some thoughts on that I'm happy to share as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And next up, Mr. Melvin Foote, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning. A lot of things going on with Africa, with the World Bank and all this kind of thing. I got to go see Macky Sall as soon as this meeting is over at the Atlantic Council. It's great to be here. I've been involved in Africa for more than 50 years now. I don't look like it because I run 5 miles a day, but I got started as a Peace Corps volunteer in Eritrea and Ethiopia in '73. And this was during the time of Haile Selassie. I've been working on Africa ever since. I spent another 3 years in Somalia as country director for Africare. And so I've been focused on Africa my entire career. Back in 1984, I was brought back to Washington by C. Payne Lucas, then president of Africare, to head up a new effort to educate Americans about Africa and to build public and private support, largely for Africare, but also for Africa. So my work actually evolved into outreach. I was going to all the conventions, the NAACP, the Urban League, the AKAs, the Links. I was just going back. I was on the airplane every day almost. But the idea was to build a base of support for Africa. CFA grew out of that work, and I formed a network called the Constituency for Africa in 1990 to be an umbrella for all of these national organizations working to work on Africa. And CFA became an independent organization in 1994 with the mission to educate the public about Africa, build public and private support for Africa, and help shape U.S. policy toward Africa. We've had a great deal of success. We evolved into the diaspora. In fact, I was one of the early ones talking about diaspora, and people didn't know what diaspora was. I took that deal from the Jewish experience. So we did a lot to try to we've been working on this for all of these years. I lobbied President Obama to set up an office on African diaspora affairs when he first came to power. He liked the idea, but he gave it to Hillary. Hillary over at the State Department ended up putting everybody who got a diaspora into one basket, and that became the diaspora. So nothing happened from it. We lobbied again with Joe Biden when he became president. We wrote a paper, and one of the efforts was to set up an African diaspora advisory. We got real specific with it, and so a lot of this grew out of that work, and I'm happy about it. But I have to say that I'm not sure the U.S. government is the best place to how the diaspora engagement effort. When you think about the African diaspora in America, you got to know that this is tied towards slavery. It's tied to the Black Power movement. It's tied to the Pan-African movement. It's tied to a lot of things. And I'm not sure the U.S. government really wants to talk about those things, not in the course. So they basically have divided up the diaspora, African immigrants, you over here, African Americans, you over there. And it created a lot of dissension, a lot of fragmentation. And I'm not sure the ball has been moved all that far on that. So I'm a strong proponent of it. I'm going to continue to promote it and push it. But I think in order for the African diaspora to really be galvanized, we need resources, and I'm constantly pounding the door. We need resources to do town hall meetings on Africa. We need seminars, workshops. We need coloring books for the young ones. We need all kinds of things to educate Americans about Africa. And those resources are not forthcoming for whatever reason. They're not forthcoming. So for the U.S. government to say, "Oh, we're going to be the diaspora," I was at the swearing in for the African Diaspora Commission, and I have to say, while there's some outstanding people on that commission, they're not connected to the Pan-African movement. I called my good friend Julius Garvey, who is the son of Marcus Garvey. I said, "What do you think, Julius?" Julius said, "I don't even know any of these people." How are they connected to the protest movement? Why are they connected to? So I'm all for the fact that we're making progress, and we need to continue to make progress, but we have a long way to go. There's a lot of work ahead. It's a hard job. It's a hard job, and you have to do it because your heart is in it, not because you're getting paid to do it. And I'm not so sure a lot of people are ready to do that. So I'll leave it there. We got a lot of things to talk about.
All righty, thank you. Next up, Professor Wendy Wilson. You're muted.
My apologies. So I'm happy to say I'm a graduate of African Studies Center at Howard University, and very happy to be here with Krista Johnson. I studied under people like Joe Harris, who wrote a lot about the African diaspora, and Suleiman Yang and others. And so I'm going to try to be brief and bring up a few ideas that I think I know are important to me. One is that I think that we have to do some theoretical work because we're working with overlapping communities, some of whom are, I like this phrase the ambassador used, legacy populations of African Americans, but we also have a layer of a Caribbean diaspora and their descendants here. And then we have what we like to call the new diaspora, which is here in the US. So how do we take advantage of and facilitate discussions, as Mel Foote was just saying, among these different constituencies, and sort of take the upper hand so that we define and we create our own narrative as opposed to responding and reacting to an external narrative. So my next idea that I'd like to share is that I think that the youth, the descendants, the second generation of African immigrants are a really pivotal population for trying to incite change because of their experiences on U.S. universities, because of their experiences on the street with police. They are really at an intersection of several different identities, and that we can look at that community as an interesting point of idea exchange. And then finally, I also am interested in the fact that we have different, I would say, historically parallel concepts of Africa in the United States and in Africa. Many Africans from the continent think that African Americans are recently talking about Africa, but as early as the early 19th century, African Americans already had a concept of Africa, and that concept grew independently of the concept of Africa that evolved on the continent under colonialism. So we also have a problem of facilitating, I think, communication so that people can get along and understand the different positionalities that are at play. And I hope, I don't know, I would have to ask Dr. Johnson to what extent, or Mel, to what extent has the government really exploited the Title VI centers in talking about this Africa diaspora? It's a very important issue, even in academia, where there has unfortunately been some exclusion, some positions of purity, of lack of credibility for African Americans. We have a problem because we have a diminishing pipeline of African American scholars, for example, coming into the African Studies Association. And I am here. Anybody who's working on that, I'm here for it, because it's a serious problem compared to the last generation in terms of who's participating, who's in graduate school, who's even thinking about going to study Africa. So I think there's, several places, as Mel Foote just said, where we can interface with this problem and affect it. And I certainly hope that we can contribute something meaningful. I'm in Easton, Pennsylvania, at Lafayette College, which is pretty much between New York and Philly. So I'm not an hour away from DC. I can pop down there from time to time, but I'm really interested in what happens and in really protecting the participation of African Americans, as well as widening that and facilitating communication among these different communities. And I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off there. Thank you very much. We also have joining us a senior fellow of FPRI, Michael Walsh. Michael, you have anything you want to add before we get sort of into the discussion here? A couple of minutes.
Yeah, so I'll echo one thing and I'll add one thing. So echoing what Wendy just said on the theoretical side, the conceptual side, and this is something that Dr. Johnson has contributed a lot to in the policy world. There is a need to really try, and it's a political question, but to try to figure out what counts as a diaspora and in which contexts, because I think that what counts as a diaspora changes depending on the context for some people. And so we saw this with the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. They tried to define in the strategy what counts as the African diaspora. And that led to a lot of discussion and a lot of debate as to whether they conceptualized it correctly or whether they used it once they had conceptualized it, whether they actually implemented it fairly across the concept. And so that became a debate. So I think that the concept and how we define it and how you draw mind maps and how we draw barriers, and then what daonic powers go with it. What are the rights, the responsibilities, the obligations that the state has to the diaspora, that the diaspora has to the state? Because there's an instrumental aspect to all of this. And when we're talking about foreign policy and using the diaspora in foreign policy, that there's a power dynamic behind all of this. The state wants to use the African diaspora to achieve goals and objectives of the state. And the diaspora wants to be able to use the platforms and the activities of the state to advance its own interests too. And then you have other actors at play. And so all of this, to sort of echo what Wendy said, it really matters. And it's all political. And I think that's why it's so contentious sometimes. But it's important because we don't have sort of common agreement, and we might never have common agreement. And I think it's not unique to the African diaspora, it's any diaspora. What's part of the diaspora, what's not part of the diaspora, and in what context. So I think that point that Wendy made is really, really important. And then I would say the other thing that I would say is important is that we don't just have theoretical work to do, we have strategic planning work to do. And I think one of the unfortunate things that happened in the course of the Biden administration's term in office so far is that the strategy for sub-Saharan Africa kind of came after a lot of the planning had already been done in the embassies for this 4 years. And so when you look at it, you see a lot of sort of in the strategic plans of the State Department, where you see the emphasis is at the regional level. You see it in the Joint Regional Strategy for Africa. And you see it in the national strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a lot of talk about the diaspora in these two documents. Well, I wouldn't say a lot, but there's more than in a lot of the integrated country strategies. But then when you look down at the integrated country strategies, I mean, it pops off. It's like right at the top of the Nigeria one, which, you know, people might expect. And you see it mentioned in places like the Zimbabwe integrated country strategy, but there's a lot that make no mention of the diaspora anywhere in their strategic plans. And, you know, I think that when we talk about what Melvin was talking about trying to move this forward and trying to make it more of a commitment, what we have to do is make sure that there's a prioritization of this, not just in words, but in actions. And that means that this has to sort of bubble down into the mission level, and the missions have to grab it. And I think some are, but I don't think that it's even, and I don't think that it's necessarily all that strategic right now. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of throw something out for each of you to briefly respond to, if you will, and that is, you know, there's been a history in this country, especially of strategy toward Africa being more of a condition of benign neglect. And that is that in the 50 years that I was in government and in the last 10 years that I've been watching it, we come up with rather high-sounding plans, and we publish them and we publicize them, and then we go back to business as usual, and really nothing of consequence gets done. I mean, there are exceptions, PEPFAR and others. How do you see what's being done or not done in this whole initiative about reaching out to the diaspora that fits that unfortunate pattern of the past of benign neglect? Let's start with Melvin. What's your view on that?
Well, you know, when I first came to Washington, there were many African Americans in the State Department, AID, at highest levels. And, you know, I used to go around and see Sarah Moulton over in education and go and see, now they're gone. And African Americans, by and large, have been replaced by African immigrants. And a lot of the immigrants who are in these jobs now were trained out in Nebraska, Oral Roberts, places like that. They brought to Washington, and they live as far away from the Black community as they can. And I know them all, you know, but none of them will call you up and say, hey, can we have coffee and talk about this stuff? So I'm thinking that we've been basically manipulated. The U.S. government wants oil, gas. They want the diamond and the coltan, and they want all these minerals in Africa. That is really the only objective, you know. And, you know, we talk about Russia, we talk about China, we talk about the other places that are competing for those resources. But I think the U.S. had a golden opportunity with the Sahel countries turning away from France so abruptly. Now we're looking at Senegal. And the U.S. position on it should be, well, I mean, what has France done for you lately, you know, as opposed to coming up with a new strategy for Africa, that Africans buy into it and clearly see that we are with you. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of how the African diaspora can actually have this impact. We're divided, we're fragmented. There is no consensus to try to bring us together to bridge the gap. And until we could come to that point, I don't see us having anything more than window dressing in terms of actually the policies toward Africa. Sure, they want to say, we got a diaspora behind us. Long as we do what they say what they want us to do, as long as we act accordingly. So I think from where I sit, I think we're going the wrong direction in terms of you know, engaging the diaspora fully in U.S. Africa policy.
Wendy, you had a comment in the comment box. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had to signal those two people that I looked up to so much when I was first starting. So I feel like I'm in good company. I did work several times with USAID in West Africa. And one of the things that I can say is that the United States left a huge void in West Africa that was part of its pulling away from disinvesting really in soft diplomacy in the United States when in Africa when it started closing its U.S. Information Agency American Centers. That was the beginning, and so it has continued. But I think that there's still some clear actions that we can take. And in response to some of what Mel was saying, I think we have to recognize that the African diaspora is not homogeneous, and we have the talent and the intellectual weight within the African American community to be able to comment on that and to lead that conversation. We have people like Michael Gomez. We have many people who study this and who understand that Nigerians have their own particular history, Ghanaians have a history, and the new immigrants up in the Bronx from Guinea and Senegal are different African diaspora. So I think that we have to think about this big void that was left with the sort of withdrawal of soft diplomacy. But I also think that as the hosts, it's historically, whether we like it or not, we are the de facto hosts of these Black diasporans, these African diasporans. And that suggests a certain responsibility to act like hosts and to initiate things, to put a hand out, to try to keep the conversation going. I mean, Mel has been working on this for years, and so have others, but I think that's the direction that we have to go in, and not make the mistake for which Biden was sharply critiqued by the former diplomat from the AU. I can't remember her name right now.
Shiambori.
That's right. Who really very explicitly complained about the fact that the African leaders were handed an agenda. So certainly, I think that we have to, there's some really interesting PowerPoints that we can interact with here in the United States. For example, many African diaspora populations in the new diaspora vote in their home countries. Two, they're looking for allies, desperately looking for allies in the private sector who can help them get things done. They may not be sexy things, but they represent avenues to start creating influence. So I think that we really have a lot of the components that we need. But if the government makes the error of not talking to African leaders, we don't have to make the same error. We have a lot of really influential people from different countries in Africa, like down at Austin in the University of Texas, like at Columbia. There are a lot of people that we can interact with and begin to carve and even demonstrate another awareness of sort of African leadership. We can talk about the huge amount of the huge contributions to African economies that your everyday working African immigrants make through sending money at home. A lot of Americans aren't even aware that in Ghana and Senegal, that money surpasses whatever they get from any foreign aid packages. So I think there's a lot that we can do in different approaches. And also, I think we have to really, I know this is a sort of unpopular approach, but anyway, class exists, and it exists among Africans, and all the Africans aren't the same. And the more you know about Africa, the less that people will try to push certain pretensions on you. So people who are having the worst time with African Americans are the poorest African immigrants who are interacting with them, working long hours in hospitals, cheap jobs and daycares where the labor competition is the sharpest. So I know there are misunderstandings among others, but the most antagonistic ones, I think, are happening where the people are less exposed. So I'll just start the conversation with that. I'll stop there.
Right, thank you. Krista, your feelings on that?
So I think that you're right, that we're kind of, even, after the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, we had a bunch of high-level delegations and, kind of cabinet-level visits to the continent. But, by and large, right, U.S. policy hasn't changed really in any radical ways, over the past however many decades. I think some of that has to do with the nature of American politics and our kind of interest group politics. And I think here, the African diaspora, as it is emerging, and as we're talking about in terms of the kinds of divisions that are already becoming visible, I think could learn a lot of lessons from other diasporas here in the United States. I know I live in Montgomery County, and we have a large Chinese diaspora and Indian, South Asian diaspora. But they've, after decades really, right, of kind of seeing themselves, and they are different, seeing themselves as different diasporas, they have also figured out how to come together politically to get, agendas passed in terms of having an Asian diaspora. Right. If they can do it, and those are two very different populations, then you would think that an African diaspora could also do that. But we're just kind of, I think, starting that process much later. But there are those possibilities, and I think there are lessons that we could learn from those other diasporas. I would also just say, so just kind of back to kind of U.S. policy and this idea of benign, kind of neglect. I think that we haven't sufficiently taken advantage of what is really our comparative advantage on the continent, having such a large and a diverse African diaspora. And I think, again, just going back to my higher education, kind of focus. There's a lot that can be done there. One of, I think, the weakest, links or the weakest commitments that came out of the summit was the commitments towards higher education. We all know, for example, that we know that Africa has the youngest population. We're going to have all of these hundreds of millions of young Africans who are going to need to be educated. And they simply do not have the institutions of higher education. They don't have the faculty to train and educate all of those numbers. This is an area where the diaspora could really come in. We have models that could be scaled up that would really fill these needs in important ways. At the moment we're talking about, I know there was some banding about like student exchanges and those kinds of things, but I really think if we're going to support, for example, the AU's commitment to train 100,000 African PhDs in the next 10 years, we need to have long-term partnerships or exchanges of African diaspora faculty to institutions on the continent to train that next generation of PhDs who will then become faculty members and researchers and others at higher education institutions in the United States. That requires, again, going back to Mel's point, we talk a lot of good talk, but there's no funding or resources that are put behind these initiatives. I know some of you on this call are probably going to participate in the University Partnerships Summit, which is taking place next week at the State Department. And the big question there is wonderful ideas, but where is the money and the resources that are going to be put behind this to actually make it work? That's our comparative advantage. I think that, getting out of the kind of the superpowers or the big power, kind of rifts with China and Russia is not really constructive for the United States. We would do much better. PEPFAR is a good model of this. We would do much better if we really just, kind of activated our diaspora to make significant strides in any number of fields: healthcare, education, technology, transfer, agriculture, all of those, I think would be a much sounder path for us to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, you want to chime in there with a brief
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things when we talk about the risk of the diaspora, and I'll use the white Southern African diaspora living in the U.S. and their engagement with think tanks and with the press and with others to try to advocate for certain causes. You know, there is this sort of, I would say, generalization that tends to happen a lot in the narrative about the African diaspora. But when you drill down to individual diasporas and you drill down to their individual engagement, you know, the discussion we're talking about, you know, having political power, about using political power, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. And it can both reinforce U.S. foreign policy, it can undermine U.S. foreign policy, and it can cause, you know, positives and harms back on the African continent. And, you know, one of the issues I think is really interesting right now is sort of the engagement around this Western Cape sovereignty movement that you hear about, and the promotion of that. And, you know, do you treat that as part of this general discussion we're having on the African diaspora, or do you treat it as something else? Is it something separate from that? And I think that, you know, these are really hard, complicated issues. But this reawakening hasn't just happened in the context of the general, it's happened in the context of the specific as well. So these specific diasporas really do matter, and what they're doing and how they're making use of political power and political outreach and what causes they're advocating for and how that's you know, impacting U.S. policy, both domestic and foreign, is really important to understand. And it gets back to Krista's point about funding and making sure that we have enough funding so that we don't have knowledge gaps, that we understand what's happening out there. Because it's important for our country. It's not just important for you know, our relations with other countries. It's important domestically. We need to understand you know, what we know and what we don't know. And I think, you know, if we don't have more funding, that gap about what we don't know is going to get bigger and bigger.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to the audience questions, I noticed that one member of the audience has a hand up. If you have your hand up because you have a question, please put your question in the Q&A box. We don't have the facilities to be able to let you speak. So now let's go to the audience questions here. The first question is, how do we put in place policies that encourage investment in Africa rather than aid and creating a dependence on aid and charities? Let's go to Wendy. You want to?
Sure. I think this gets back to money. We really have to, just as some countries encourage people to go into medicine, and how we are right now in a big wave talking about STEM, we've got to create opportunities for young Americans to learn about Africa in the long term. That is a very, very important input. And I also think that, tell me specifically what the issue was again.
Well, how do we create policies that
Okay.
encourage investment as opposed to aid and dependency on aid and charities?
I think the other thing is that we have lots of young African immigrants who are studying finance and economics. We have lots of young African Americans from the legacy population. And somehow we need to make an initiative where people from those communities visit corporations here in the U.S. and in particular, middle-sized businesses who in some ways are more agile because they don't even know what is there to invest in. Most of them haven't even seen African cities. So what you really need is a kind of a delegation that visits potential investors and who has a website also, by the way, and the capacity to respond, who can go and without trying to do a particular thing right away, make sure people know about Africa, make people know about how big the cities in Africa are, what kind of infrastructure some African cities have, like Maputo, like Cape Town, like Nairobi, like Dakar. Most people have no idea. So they don't know that. One thing that I think is interesting is to show Americans how they can so easily be outdone by their European counterparts if they don't get on the job. You know, England and France are there. Germany has almost twice the representation that the United States has, now that we've closed our American cultural centers. So I think we have to, those of us who can, build some kind of capacity and invest in initiating communication with the corporate world, finding out what's there first. That's the most
Right.
important. Who are the actors already, and then scouting out the young one. I know here at my school, there are a lot of young stars who have studied economics and banking, who could be pulled into that type of thing, and
All right,
not
thank you.
necessarily through school.
Right, thank you. Next question. How active is the Southern African region in this initiative? Who would like to take a stab at that one? Melvin, I see you move. Oh,
I can, well, I want to say one question about the previous question. You know, when I came to Washington, the U.S. policy toward Africa was really dropping food out of an airplane, you know, and we killed more people with those pallets coming out of the air than we helped them. And the ambassador from Uganda and Senegal back then came to me and said, look, we need a new paradigm. We want to have a trade relationship. And that was the forbearing for AGOA. Now, AGOA was an attempt to shift this discussion to trade as opposed to aid. But the Africans have become addicted to aid. And when AGOA came along, they thought it was another aid program. So they didn't train their entrepreneurs to access the U.S. market. They didn't do anything to make African products more receptive to the U.S. market. So you ask me, why did AGOA not succeed? Partly because we didn't educate Americans about Africa, and then African leaders didn't educate their own entrepreneurs about doing business in the United States. And so, you know, to me, there's a gap there, and I don't think that gap has. Now, in terms of Southern Africa, you know, Zimbabwe is an interesting state. You know, that's your country, Ambassador. I think it's one of the most beautiful spots in the world, you know. And it's absolutely, if you haven't gone to Great Zimbabwe, you haven't gone to Africa. But I think part of it has to do with the legacy of colonialism and that sort of thing. For some reason, we're much more drawn to West Africa as a country, partly because Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal are so close. But I think that the Southern African region, by and large, see themselves as a bit more self-sufficient and more want to be controlled. South Africa is the case in point. Say what you want to say about South Africa's position on Gaza and some of this other stuff that make us, you know, but the reality is South Africa went through probably a more hellacious experience than we even here in the United States with apartheid. And they have worked their way through it, and they're hell-bent on becoming, you know, remaining independent and expressing their sovereignty as part of their discussion. So I don't think it's anti, but I think that we need a different strategy to work with the Southern Africa region and perhaps in other parts of the continent.
okay. Here's a two-part question. Two questions. Question one, the African diaspora holds immense potential to bridge the gap between the U.S. and Africa. Can you share your thoughts on how the U.S. can better leverage the diaspora to promote a more positive and collaborative image on the continent? And question two, many African nations are seeking diversified economic partnerships. How can the U.S., working with the African diaspora with its business acumen and culture, economic development models for Africa compared to those offered by Russia or China? Let's go to Krista first on this one.
I don't want to sound like a broken record, and maybe it's because I'm sitting here at Howard with just like all of this talent and resources, but honest, I really think that one of the best investments that we could make is to have I mean, Yali, we've seen the success with Yali, right? I mean, kind of having these, kind of exchanges and the training, and then, but also then establishing a network, right, of Yali alumni who are in these countries and then starting to do wonderful things is a real resource for us. I think there's real potential again, and this is where China and Russia cannot compete with us. African countries and Africans generally favor U.S. higher education systems, especially at the graduate level. The fact that we do like coursework during for our PhDs even puts us, I think, in a different league, if you will, than even say England or European systems, right? So I think there would be a real interest, and also just thinking about, I think, ways in which to do it where you're not reinventing the wheel. We don't need any more, say, or one model could be to have American campuses on the continent, but we don't need that. I think what you really do need is like a 5 or 10 year investment in long-term placements of African diaspora faculty. I'll volunteer. I'll volunteer to go to UZ. You're right, to Harare. I'll volunteer. You spend 5 years there training, the next cohort, training a cohort of PhDs who will then themselves go on to do research and be faculty members at those institutions. That's something that Russia cannot do, and China cannot do, right? Because, I mean, we have, and it also, I mean, it's kind of a win-win, because it would support institutions like Howard, like other HBCUs that have these resources, that have the faculty and the expertise. And then it's, I think, would be a real win-win, of course, for the African continent, because what we need is to figure out how to, in a much more accelerated way, educate this burgeoning population, which the youth bulge, which we know is either going to be an asset or a liability for the continent.
Great, thank you. Here's an interesting question. This is from Alexandria. I'm probably going to mispronounce this. Alexandria Haidara. It says, I work at the State Department and produced a podcast for Black professionals in international affairs on African diaspora engagement after the U.S.-Africa Summit. And the question is, how can we get Black American media to engage more with African media, news, and foreign policy issues?
A good question.
And on this one, I'm going to go to Michael, because he and I had an interesting experience over the last several months in just doing just that, and trying to reach out and engage the Black media here in this country on these issues. Mike, you want to?
Yeah,
take a
I mean, it
stab
starts
at
on two
answering,
levels,
Ms.
right?
Haidara's question.
Yeah, so it starts on two levels. I mean, first of all, having, especially on foreign policy, national security, having more Black journalists, having young people trained to be able to go into those roles. So they, I mean, they have a selection bias. People pick who they interview, who they engage with, right? So, we have to make sure there's diversity and inclusivity in the press itself, and there's diversity of opinion, and there's education of the press so that people understand about the diversity of opinion, and just understand where to go for sources to be able to interview and to have these conversations. And then with the Black media, in the U.S., having outreach and being able to make an argument for why this should matter to their readers, and why U.S. Africa policy is a relevant topic to somebody who's in Youngstown, Ohio, or Memphis, Tennessee, or somewhere like that, and trying to just, make the normative argument that, it's important to have these conversations in those outlets. I think one of the challenges that we have when we're looking at the future isn't really even just about trying to fix this problem, but just the media landscape's changing so radically right now. And that could create opportunities for improvement, or it can create barriers, because it could be structural barriers to disimprovement. And so I think trying to understand how the changing media landscape is going to either take away that platform or give that platform to more voices is really, really important. And I think that's what we're trying to do right now, and try to understand that.
Okay, next question. how do we create a groundswell of support and awareness among African Americans of all educational levels to become the drivers of U.S.-Africa foreign policy? Melvin, I think I'll throw that one at you.
Well, a couple of things. One, I've been working on that ever since I came to Washington, and we used a number of tools to do it. One, we talk about the black media. The black media has been decimated. Jet magazine used to be a must read for every African American, whether you're in the barber shop or the beauty shop or it's coming to your house, it's gone. Emerge magazine, which George Curry was the publisher, Bob Johnson started it, gone. Black Enterprise is a shadow of what it used to be. Ebony magazine, gone. And so I personally think that this was an intentional strategy to tap down African American, cut them off from the communications apparatus. So I think that it definitely ought to be looked at. And I talk to media every day. I'm talking to the Afro and the Informer and all of these other publications really on a daily basis. And they're struggling to survive. And if you think you're going to get this off of the internet and Facebook and social media, it's not going to happen. So I think a lot of things, we tried a strategy during the promotion of AGOA some years ago to do town hall meetings around the country. We used African ambassadors, experts, and we went to places like Memphis, Tennessee, and Jackson, Mississippi, and Denver, and Cincinnati, and so forth, promoting trade. But it also gave the average person on the ground a chance to talk to an ambassador, to really make a direct link with the continent. I think also promoting programs like the Peace Corps. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer. My daughter went through the Peace Corps. She's now in the U.S. Foreign Service. I think you look at the amount of number of African Americans in the Peace Corps, we've got 2%, if that, there's something structurally wrong. On the one hand, we say we want this diaspora, we want African American participation. On the other hand, we seem to do everything possible to make sure we don't get it. Now we're talking about DEI and some of this stuff. Some of you might lose your job because of this, or because we're having this conversation. And so there's a lot of structural problems with us moving this ball forward. And unless we have resources, then organizations like mine need to be independent. We don't need to be beholden to any big boss or oversight. We need to be able to do what we do, and we need to be independent to do it. But you'll find that the independent voices, by and large, are cut off. The resources dried up to be able to do it. I mean, this week I was over in Anacostia for the Emancipation Day Forum over across the river. And when you go across the river, you meet Black people who are very, very solidly Black. And they're talking about all of these things, including crime and whatnot, but they're doing it off of a shoestring. And if we really want to change the paradigm, we ought to be serious about how we resource it and how do we, it's in the interest of the United States to raise this diaspora. But yet we act like we don't, there's not a priority, no money for it, no real access for it, but it's in our own interest. It's in the interest of the United States to educate Americans about Africa, and yet we don't put any resources toward it. Anyway, I could talk about this all day, and I know you don't want to do that. So I'll cut off.
I'd love to do it, but we have other questions from the audience that we have to get to. Maybe we'll have you back on again to talk about this subject. But here's another question. Very interesting, and I think I'll probably let you all arm wrestle over who gets to answer it. How do we ensure that our relationship does not become exploitive, like the Francophone relationships, for example? Who wants to take a stab? Wendy, let's start with you on that one. How do we avoid creating a Francophone style relationship as we use the diaspora to reach out to the continent?
Well, the first thing I think I'm gonna sort of copy what Krista said. So I'm repeating myself, but we have to work with the people who are there. I think we have to let this idea that any diaspora, whether Atlantic diaspora, whether it's Brazilians or Haitians or African Americans, is going to sail into Africa and save the day. We have to let that go. That's 20th century. That's old now. There are many people in African countries who are overeducated for the job positions that exist. So I think that one of the things we could do to make a big difference is to tie commercial and development goals together so that the brain power that's there can work for the future of those regions. If I were really cynical, I would say maybe we should learn something from the French, which I think we already have, which is that we've excited Africans about America. All over Africa, people like African American music, they wear jeans, they do hip hop, they want to know. So as Krista was saying, so clearly we already have a lot of opening opportunities that France never had. But we have to be careful to, as I started from the beginning, we have to be very careful not to marginalize or ignore local talent and power dynamics. That is would be a terrible error. And I think the other mistakes of France, we don't have enough money to make those mistakes. It's too late. In other words, France went into Africa and constructed cities and a different kind of economy. We don't have that money. So we don't have to worry about making a mistake, I would argue. But we do have to try to be conscious of not being some other kind of colonizer and or being seen as exploitative. But we know that in Southern Africa, at one point, right after apartheid, the South Africans started feeling a little smothered by African American love, to put it in one way, and that's real. I think we have to grapple with those realities. And in fact, I mean, it's the same thing that many African Americans feel right now about African immigrants. So it's happening in many different ways in these different populations.
Well, thank you. As usual, we have far more questions than we have time. In fact, we have already run out of time, and I apologize to our audience for not being able to get to all of your questions. They're very good questions. Perhaps we will have the occasion to have another discussion about the diaspora, and you can come back and ask the questions you didn't get a chance to get answers to today. I want to thank our panelists who have been remarkable, eloquent, and certainly taught me a lot. I appreciate your input, all of you, and remind you that if you know someone who might be interested in this program, FPRI's YouTube channel will have it on, the recording on, within about 24 or 48 hours. I encourage you to share it widely. And again, I ask to those of you who are attending today to please consider supporting FPRI's program. We hope to be able to bring interesting discussions like this to you more in the future. And I look forward to seeing you all again here next time. Thank you very much and have a real nice day.